Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. It was a big weekend at the box office for Godzilla and Kong as they took the #1 spot both domestically and around the world, and we're going to look at that big opening. Speaking of Godzilla and Kong, I just put out yesterday, I think one of my longest videos ever, over an hour and a half long, where I rank 45 different movies featuring Godzilla and Kong, including every official Toho release, the theatrically released Kong movies. It's one of my biggest, most ambitious projects yet, and I would love for you to go and check that out, because the more people that watch those videos, the more I can do stuff like these big long lead projects, which I really enjoy doing. So that Godzilla and Kong ranking video right here on the channel if you want to check that out. But before we get to that, let's look at the box office for the past weekend. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire blew past expectations and opened to just over $80 million, easily topping the box office over this Easter weekend. In second place was Ghostbusters Frozen Empire with a big drop, 65.4% in its second week at a $15.5 million total. Its domestic total is now at $73.2 million. In third place was Dune Part 2 with another strong hold in its fifth weekend of release, a 35.5% drop, another $11.3 million. Its domestic total is now over $250 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 also holding well at a 37.3% drop in its fourth week of release, a $10.3 million weekend total. Its domestic total has now eclipsed over $150 million. And Immaculate, having a good hold for a horror film, dropping just 39.1% in week 2 for a $3.2 million total and a domestic total thus far of $11.1 million. So let's tackle a bunch of those movies that are in the top 5. And of course, we are going to start with the kings of the box office, Godzilla and Kong. The $80 million opening weekend is about $2.5 million shy of the best domestic opening so far in 2024. Dune Part 2 opened March with the best domestic opening weekend of the year, and Godzilla Kong closes the month with the second best. Kung Fu Panda is now in third place for the year at $57.9 million. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire gets bumped down to fourth at just over $45 million. And Bob Marley: One Love, which opened on a Wednesday, is still in third place for its Friday through Sunday opening weekend gross of $28.6 million. As far as Easter weekend goes, Godzilla Kong was the fifth best debut film over the holiday. The best Easter weekend opening is still easily Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which opened to over $180 million back in March of 2016. Then we have last year's The Super Mario Bros. Movie. Despite opening on a Wednesday, it came in a close second at $166.4 million. Then we have Furious 7 back in 2015, which opened to $161.2 million. The Fate of the Furious back in 2017, which opened to $107.3 million. And then Godzilla Kong: The New Empire with the fifth best Easter opening weekend at just over $80 million. When we look at the legendary MonsterVerse, Godzilla Kong puts up the second best opening weekend in that particular franchise. At number 1 is still 2014's Godzilla, which opened back at the beginning of the summer in 2014 to $93.1 million. It's hard to believe we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of that movie. Godzilla Kong is in second place. Kong Skull Island opened to $61 million back in March of 2017. Then we have Godzilla King of the Monsters, which opened in May 2019 to $47.7 million. And then Godzilla vs. Kong back in April 2021, which really has a double asterisk. It was released on a Wednesday, and it was, of course, one of the day-and-date HBO Max releases. So that $31.6 million probably very heavily depressed by both of those factors. When we look at the overall MonsterVerse grosses domestically, Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, of course, after just its opening weekend, is in fifth place at $80 million, but it should be passing the day-and-date suppressed gross of Godzilla vs. Kong domestically very quickly, because it's only about $20 million behind it. We should also see it pass the domestic gross of Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the financial disappointment back in 2019. So by the time we do this show next week, it'll be in at least third place. And really, it only has to get to $200 million to be the highest grossing domestic legendary MonsterVerse film. Kong Skull Island made $168 million, while 2014's Godzilla made just over $200 million. And the budget on Godzilla Kong: The New Empire reported to be about $135 million. Even if you inflate that to $150 million, given the fact that they spent pretty responsibly on the film, the audience seems to be reacting strongly. It doesn't have a huge amount of competition until we get into summer movie season. I think it's got a really good good shot at getting to that $200 million mark and becoming the highest grossing legendary monster film domestically. But what about Godzilla and Kong all time, even outside of the legendary monsterverse? Well, when you adjust the opening weekends for inflation, the highest grossing film is still 2014's Godzilla at $122.1 million. Then we have Godzilla 1998. Now, it did open on a Wednesday, but its opening Friday through Sunday gross was $83.8 million. If it had opened on a Friday, it would probably easily be number one. Then we have Godzilla Kong the New Empire at $80 million in third place, even after you adjust for inflation. 2005's King Kong would also probably be much higher on the list, but it also opened on a Wednesday. Its Friday through Sunday opening weekend gross was $79.6 million back in the holiday season of 2005. And then Kong Skull Island opened to $77.2 million, adjusted for inflation, for that fifth spot. A lot of people are giving Warner Brothers congratulations, and they deserve congratulations for having a string of hits lately, including Wonka, Dune Part 2, and Godzilla Kong the New Empire. But particularly this year, a lot of credit also has to go to Legendary, and a lot of the box office cut is also going to go to Legendary because they are behind the top two movies of the year thus far, or the movies that will eventually be the top two. It is a legendary start to 2024. When we look at Dune Part 2, it's the number one domestic opener of 2024 so far, and the number two worldwide opener of the year so far, with a domestic gross of over $250 million and a worldwide gross of over $625 million. And then Godzilla Kong the New Empire, which is also from Legendary, is the number two domestic opener, but the number one worldwide opener. So Dune Part 2 and Godzilla Kong basically splitting those two prizes. After just one weekend, Godzilla Kong has an $80 million domestic gross and a worldwide gross approaching over $200 million. And when you combine the domestic box office of Dune Part 2 and Godzilla Kong, it comes out to $332.6 million, which is equivalent to 20.7% of all domestic tickets sold this year. Just those two legendary films. Combined at the worldwide box office, the two movies have made $821.3 million and should be getting over that $1 billion mark. So it is a great start to 2024 for Legendary. I don't think they have anything else on the slate for this year, but so many of these things that they've invested in, they've taken some missteps with the Monsterverse. Obviously, with the first Dune movie, the pandemic affected the gross a lot. They are now reaping the rewards of movies that audiences seem to like and are actually turning up to go see in theaters. I mentioned Ghostbusters Frozen Empire's big drop, and you can see here how it compares to Ghostbusters Afterlife. We talked last weekend that they had nearly identical opening weekends, but we are seeing a steep divergence now. Now, Ghostbusters Afterlife was helped by being released around the Thanksgiving holiday, but when you look at it through 10 days of release, it's now opened up about a $14 million lead over Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. And if Ghostbusters Frozen Empire continues to flatline, as it seems to be doing, the $100 million domestic gross appears to be in jeopardy. It is not going to match the gross of Ghostbusters Afterlife. And when we talked last week about the movie and whether or not it was a hit, looking in the con column about what its prospects looked like going forward, it looks like they're winning out. The mixed to bad reviews, the B+ cinema score, those I think contributed to that 65% weekend 2 drop. And then the competition, Godzilla Kong the New Empire, was the movie that people wanted to see this weekend, and they didn't really seem too interested in seeing Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. The funny thing is, those two subtitles, The New Empire and Frozen Empire, you could almost switch those two and they would still make sense to those specific movies. But yeah, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, when you look at the scheduling and stuff, putting it the weekend before another huge release, and then you go back and look at 2024 thus far, and the weeks that we had in January and February where there was just absolutely nothing in theaters, you have to wonder why strategically they decided to put that there. That happened last year, if you'll remember, with March. There were so many movies that were just stacked up one after the other after the other. Super Mario Brothers, John Wick, Dungeons and Dragons. Not all of them survived, and we had the same question. Why did they stack so many movies together? But that was the decision that was made. Anyway, it does look like Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is in some trouble, especially because it's a domestic heavy franchise. We'll see how it does next weekend, but prospects are not looking great for this being a breakout hit or even a small-sized hit. Two movies that we've been tracking as far as their performance are Dune Part 2 and Oppenheimer because they share a lot of similarities. The focus on the premium big screen experience, the visionary directors. And as has been happening, Oppenheimer continues to open up its lead as far as total domestic gross. It was never really expected that Dune Part 2 was going to equal what Oppenheimer made. At this point in its release, 31 days, Oppenheimer had made $285.3 million to Dune's $252.6 million. And as we've been noting for the past month, the reason that Oppenheimer's been able to pull ahead is because its weekdays have been consistently ahead of Dune Part 2, while the weekends have been very, very similar. And we actually had, for the first time this weekend, in the 5th weekend of release for both films, a switch in that Dune Part 2 made more than Oppenheimer in its 5th weekend. The first time its weekend gross has outdone Oppenheimer. And when you look at the end of the chart there, days 29, 30, and 31, the blue there is Dune Part 2. It outgrossed Oppenheimer on Friday. That breaks the trend. Oppenheimer's had bigger Fridays thus far. And it also outgrossed Oppenheimer on Saturday, which is what Dune Part 2 has been doing since the beginning. Oppenheimer had a slightly better 5th Sunday, and that was enough to give Dune Part 2 a bigger weekend number 5 by about $600,000. It's not a big number, but I just think it's interesting that the behavior pattern continues here with the weekdays boosting up that summer release, obviously helping Oppenheimer there. But audiences warmly embracing both films, very obviously, and it bears out in the box office results. Let's look at numbers 6 through 10 for the past weekend. Arthur the King drops to number 6 with a 41.7% drop in week 3, a $2.4 million weekend total. Its domestic total now around $19 million. Late Night with the Devil, which I would have seen this past week, except I was buried in Godzilla and Kong movies. It's on my watch list. I'm going to try to see it this week. Has a good hold. It actually added theaters in its 2nd weekend of release. Just a 23.7% drop, a $2.1 million total, a domestic total around $6.2 million. And if theater owners hold on to this movie, we could see a word of mouth growing hit here. In 8th place is a film from India named Tilu Square. It's a delayed Telugu language film and a sequel to 2022's DJ Tilu. It made $1.87 million, I think. As often happens with Indian movies released here in the US, there are conflicting numbers as far as how much it made over the last weekend. Some people have the movie higher, some people have the movie lower. It's in this 6 through 8 range. That's what we know. And the final numbers eventually will bear out. But it is very frustrating, and I've talked about this on the show before, to try to get accurate numbers for Indian releases because we even have conflicting information a lot of the times. In 9th place was another Indian film called Crew at $1.5 million. Again, according to some sources, it's a Hindi language heist film. And then in 10th place in its 4th week of release is Imaginary, which drops 50% from last weekend, a $1.39 million total, and a domestic total now over $25 million. 3 movies dropped out of the top 10 this past weekend. After 6 weeks, Bob Marley One Love has ended its top 10 run. After 3 weeks, Angel Studios' Cabrini is out of the top 10. And then Love Lies Bleeding, which was in limited release for 1 weekend, was in the top 10 for 2 weekends, is now out of the top 10 overall. A very divisive film, which I think probably shortened its stay. Looking at the most theaters lost for this past weekend, the American Society of Magical Negroes was just punted out of wide release. It lost 1,000 of its theaters. It's now only in 152 around the country, so theater owners were not waiting for the audience to show up, and they never really did show up. Love Lies Bleeding also lost over half its theaters, 970 theaters gone. It remains in 858 theaters, so it's out of wide release. Bob Marley One Love is also out of wide release. It lost 673 theaters. It remains in 593 around the country. Imaginary lost 557 theaters. It's still in 1,956. And Arthur the King lost 487 theaters, although it's still in over 2,500 theaters around the country. Let's take a look at what I like to call the road to recovery. The blue line is the average weekend gross for the years 2015 through 2019. The red line is the average weekend gross for the years 2021 to 2023 when theaters reopened. And then the dotted black line is the box office for each weekend this year. And as you can see, we are much closer to where we were than where we have been, although we haven't quite hit those heights so far. The highest grossing film for the 2015 to 2019 window was the release of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice back in 2016. And prior to this year, the highest grossing film from 2021 to 2023 was Morbius. That's right, it's been 2 years since we got Morbed. Can you believe it? Oh, it seems like yesterday. Last week I said that Oppenheimer hadn't reported any grosses and I was going to hold off on calling it closed to see if grosses came in for it this week, and they didn't. So even though Oppenheimer may be playing in some theaters around the country still, I'm sure it probably is, it appears that the grosses are not being reported anymore, which means that I am going to officially call it closed. So after 35 weeks of release, Oppenheimer is not reporting grosses anymore. Right now it's at $329.8 million. 35 weeks in theaters, you don't see that anymore. It opened in the summer movie season of 2023 and closed as we're talking about summer movie season 2024. So an incredibly impressive theatrical run for Oppenheimer. Poor Things closes its run after 4 months at $34.5 million, taking that last little gasp of box office air after those Academy Award wins. And then The Beekeeper closes after 11 weeks at $66.2 million. As I said, there's some extra dollars that could come trickling in because it may not be out of all theaters nationwide. But as far as gross reporting, every single weekend it appears that the stories have been written on those 3 films. And let's take a look at Oppenheimer and its profitability estimates. I think I made this chart back in last July or August. It's crazy that we're here in April and I'm now doing the final chart. So to finalize these numbers, it brought in $61.6 million from China, at about 22.5% coming back to investors. That's around $13.8 million. Around $229.4 million coming back internationally, with the caveat that it's still making money internationally. It just opened in Japan this past weekend. So while the books may be closed or closing on Oppenheimer domestically, they're not closed internationally. And then looking at it domestically, about $76.7 million coming in from its great opening, $39.6 million coming in from its second week, and then another $64.9 million coming in from its week 3 plus domestic run because it had such long legs at the box office. I have a budget of $100 million, an advertising budget of another $100 million. That puts costs at $200 million. Its current worldwide gross sits at $965.1 million. I'm estimating a net gross of $424.6 million. You subtract costs of $200 million, and remember, Christopher Nolan reportedly has a deal where he got 20% of the first dollar gross. So I'm estimating about $85 million going into Christopher Nolan's pocket for this movie. That's what happens when you have faith in your own work. Even when you take all that out, I'm estimating that Oppenheimer brought in a theatrical profit of $139.7 million, and that's before you add in streaming revenue, digital revenue, if they license the film out later on. This movie is a massive moneymaker, a huge Academy Award winner. There are no losers, really. Oppenheimer was a winner for every single person and entity involved in its production, and for a film as ambitious as it was and as risky as it was, I'm really happy with this result. We've got so much more to talk about here on Charts, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by Miracle Made. We're transitioning from winter to spring, which for me means that I have to relearn my whole sleep routine. Some nights it's warm, some nights it's cold, and for a hot sleeper like me, that can equal lots of tossing and turning. But this year, the transition has been a lot easier with Miracle Made. Miracle Made sheets are designed to keep your body temperature right where you need it to be, helping you sleep no matter what season it is. Their silver-infused fabric also prevents up to 99.7% of bacterial growth, and they're incredibly comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands. These sheets aren't about function over comfort. Miracle Made sheets are some of the most comfortable that I've ever had, and I have noticed a difference with a lot less waking up sweating or with one leg dangling over the edge of the bed. And Miracle Made sheets are self-cleaning and could require up to 3 times less laundry. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan to try Miracle Made sheets today, and whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code Dan at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you're not 100% satisfied, you will get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiraclemade.com/Dan and use the code Dan to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/Dan to treat yourself. Thanks to Miracle Made for sponsoring this episode. Let's take a look now at the top 5 films outside of the US and Canada internationally. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire makes over $100 million from international markets. It opened in a lot of places, including China this past weekend at $114 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 makes another $43.6 million internationally. Dune Part 2 made $18.4 million. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire made $11.2 million. And then in 5th place is a German film called Chantal im Markenland, or Chantal in Fairyland. It's a fantasy spin-off of a film series that began with the movie Fuck You, Goethe, which is translated into English as Suck Me, Shakespeare. I think they still cleaned it up a little bit. It did not have to face competition in Germany from Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, which opens there this weekend, so it comes in at number 5 internationally. When we take those international grosses, we combine them with our domestic grosses, we get the top 5 films around the world this past weekend, and Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is king of the world, $194 million in its opening weekend, again, because it had so many markets that was bringing in income, and it seems like it's positioned for a good box office run. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks. Kung Fu Panda 4 drops just 24.7% as it continues to bring in a lot of money internationally, another $54 million worldwide. Dune Part 2 drops 38.4%, brings in another $29.7 million around the world. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire also having a somewhat steep drop around the world when you include all grosses, 56.4% decline from its opening weekend at $26.7 million, and Chantal im Markenland at $6.8 million remains in number 5. And looking at the 2024 worldwide Hollywood debuts this year, opening in China helps Godzilla Kong: The New Empire take that number 1 spot. Remember, Dune Part 2 did not open the same weekend in China as it did in other countries, and I believe that was the difference maker. So $194 million for Godzilla Kong, the biggest worldwide debut of the year. Dune Part 2 now a respectable $182.5 million. It's fine for the second best debut worldwide for a Hollywood film this year. Then we have Kung Fu Panda 4, which made $80.2 million in its worldwide debut. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire at $61.4 million, and Bob Marley: One Love at $57.6 million. And looking at the top grossing legendary MonsterVerse films worldwide, I was actually surprised that Kong Skull Island currently is the highest grossing legendary film at $568.6 million. Godzilla 2014 at $529 million is second worldwide for the legendary MonsterVerse. Then we have Godzilla vs. Kong, which made a lot of money in international markets at $470.1 million. Godzilla King of the Monsters at $387.3 million. And then Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, which is already at almost $200 million worldwide. And again, if it can get to $575 million, it will be the highest grossing legendary MonsterVerse film globally. So we'll see what it has in store. Let's return to the domestic marketplace and look at some other charts from this past weekend in the box office, and we'll start with the per theater averages. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, one of the rare wide releases to also have the top per theater average at $20,721 in each of its 3,861 theaters. So theater owners were very happy to have Godzilla Kong this past weekend. Wicked Little Letters comes in second place, bringing in $15,530 in just 5 theaters. This film was released earlier in the year in the UK. It stars Olivia Colman and Jessie Buckley about a prim woman who receives obscene letters in the mail. Le Samurai, a 4K re-release and restoration of Jean-Pierre Melville's influential 1967 crime film, which is often cited among the best movies ever made, brought in $14,899 in just 1 theater. La Chimera, which is an Italian film that debuted at last year's Cannes Film Festival, brought in $14,837 per theater, playing in 3 theaters. And then On the Adamant, a French documentary about a floating care center on the Seine for adults needing mental health care, brought in $6,371 in its 1 theater. And Godzilla Kong's per theater average puts it amongst the 5 best per theater averages for the year so far. Dune Part 2 barely gets bumped down to number 5, bringing in $20,267,000 per theater in 4,071 theaters. So the fact that Godzilla Kong: The New Empire brought in slightly more per theater and about 150 fewer theaters also means that Godzilla Kong: The New Empire more than likely or almost certainly sold more tickets in the first week than Dune Part 2. The difference being that the premium experience was such a big part of Dune Part 2's release strategy that the opening domestically was just a little bit higher, even though Godzilla Kong sold more tickets. It wasn't so IMAX focused and that's what made the difference, the increase in those premium ticket sale prices. Looking at the top limited release films this past weekend, Toulouse Square and Crew are numbers 1 and 2. Toulouse Square was only in 450 theaters but brought in $1.87 million. Crew was in 486 theaters and brought in $1.5 million. Liam Neeson's In the Land of Saints and Sinners was in under 1,000 theaters. It was in 896 theaters but brought in just over $1 million. Another Indian film called The Goat Life in the Malayalam language brought in $625,000 in an unknown number of theaters. And then South Korea's Exuma continues its successful limited run at $371,000, playing in 69 theaters around the country. Looking at 2024's annual domestic box office, we have some changes. Dune Part 2 remains number 1, Kung Fu Panda 4 remains number 2, and Bob Marley One Love remains number 3. But Godzilla Kong The New Empire enters the chart at number 4 and is looking to quickly climb that chart. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire moves into the top 5 at $73.2 million. Mean Girls moves down 2 spots, as does The Beekeeper. Argyle moves down 1 spot to number 8. Madam Web moves down to number 9. Night Swim moves down to number 10. And Imaginary is off of the 2024 annual box office chart. Looking at all tickets sold since January 1st, domestically, so it doesn't matter when the movie came out, Dune Part 2, Kung Fu Panda 4, and Bob Marley One Love are numbers 1, 2, and 3. Wonka right now is at number 4. It sold $85.2 million worth of tickets in 2024, but Godzilla Kong The New Empire will be the number 4 movie very soon. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire comes in at number 6 on the chart. Migration drops down 2 spots to number 7. Mean Girls drops 2 to number 8. The Beekeeper drops 2 to number 9. Anyone But You drops 2 to number 10, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom and Argyle are both off of the calendar gross chart for 2024. Worldwide, Dune Part 2 remains the number 1 movie of the year, $627.3 million. It's trying to get to $700 million. China's YOLO and Pegasus 2 remain numbers 2 and 3, but Kung Fu Panda moves up 2 spots to number 4. It's at almost $350 million worldwide. Article 20 from China moves down 1 spot to number 5. Boonie Bear's Time Twist moves down 1 spot to number 6. Godzilla Kong The New Empire and its $194 million opening weekend are good enough for number 7 on the chart, and again, it's going to try to climb it very quickly. Bob Marley One Love moves down 1 to number 8. The Beekeeper moves down 1 to number 9. And Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is now a $100 million plus global grosser. It drops out Mean Girls as well as Madam Web. Before we go, as I often like to do, I want to look at a weekend in box office history. We're not going to go too far back this time. We're going back to March 26th to the 28th, 2010, the 13th week of the year, which saw the debut of a new animated series called How to Train Your Dragon, which is still popular nearly 15 years after the first movie came out. It opened to $43.7 million. Its domestic final total was right around $217.5 million. In second place was Alice in Wonderland. In its fourth week of release, it brought in $17.7 million, and its domestic total was at right around $334.1 million. If you adjusted it for inflation, it'd be around $500 million. That movie has Avatar to thank for so many things, especially getting people to go see it in 3D. Hot Tub Time Machine opened this weekend in 2010 at $14 million. Its domestic final was right around $50 million. The Bounty Hunter, starring Jennifer Aniston and Jared Butler, dropped 42% in its second weekend on March 26th through 28th, 2010, for a domestic total around $12 million for the weekend. Its final was right around $67 million. Also in its second weekend was Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which brought in $10.1 million. Its domestic total was around $64 million. I'm not going to do the inflation adjustment this week because it's not a drastic change. So we are going to go ahead and skip right along to the part where I tell you what's coming out this upcoming week, what we're going to be talking about on the show next week. The big release, the one I'm looking forward to seeing the most, is Monkey Man from director Dev Patel. Jordan Peele threw his weight behind this movie and it's getting a big theatrical release. I'm really looking forward to this one. You're going to see a review for that movie right here on the channel. I'm also hearing some positive things about The First Omen. Sometimes horror movies are hyped up a little bit before they open, but I'm going to try to check it out this week. It is a prequel to the Omen series. And then opening in a lot of markets is a movie called Someone Like You, which sounds interesting. It's about a guy whose best friend dies and then he finds her twin sister and falls in love with her. I don't know what's going on there. It's from novelist Karen Kingsbury. It's mainly being marketed toward the Christian faith-based audience, so we'll see if that pops up in the top 10 next week. And that wraps it up for Charts with Dan for this week. If you want to keep going and you want a feature-length video, again, I've got that Godzilla Kong ranked video right here on the channel. But really, thanks so much for spending part of your day here with me. As I mentioned, I'll be back later this week with more movie news, reviews. There could be some big Disney news coming out this week with their big shareholder meeting. I'm going to be tracking all of that stuff, and you never know what's going to happen here on the channel. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.